Welcome. Glad to see everyone this morning. Some familiar faces, some new faces. As Mike said, my name is Sharice Flynn. Why am I here? Why am I doing this class? I feel very grateful that I've had a lot of experience and been able to learn some of these things the hard way. Also been able to learn through my clients. So what I'm going to be sharing today is direct experience. I was the COO of Dwala for over 6 years, and during my time there, we raised around $32 million in venture capital, both from local investors, strategic investors, coastal investors. Andreessen Horowitz, which is a well-known investor, was one of our investors. Had the opportunity to move to San Francisco and grow our team for Dwala in San Francisco. So have kind of that West Coast experience. Then more locally, the last 2.5 years, I've helped around just about a half a dozen companies raise over $20 million in venture capital. You can tell that number that most of those rounds have been early stage in the 500K to 1.5 million. One of my clients just closed an $8 million round. So that's kind of the variance of what I've seen both locally and in the Midwest. And we'll be bringing that experience to this class today. This is somewhat hard for me to just stand up in front the entire day, so I'm going to try to make it as interactive as possible. But like Mike said, we're trying to pack in a lot of information, trying to give you an overview of all the things that happen along the fundraising journey, so that at least you're starting to think about them ahead of time, or if not, you'll experience them when you're in the journey. That was my experience. Some of these things came up and I was like, wow, I wish someone would have told me about that ahead of time. So those are the things we're going to try to share. I'm, again, very interactive, so if you have a question, pop up your hand. If it gets out of control, I'll let you know, but more questions are welcome. So when I try to think about how do I put a framework around fundraising, what came to mind was 3 key areas: momentum, materials, and meeting. So if you're summarizing, how do I think about the fundraising process? I think the first most important key is momentum in your business. And that can mean a lot of different things depending on, are you at the idea stage, customers, do you have any PR? Do people know about you? Momentum as far as brand awareness goes. Then momentum has to carry through that entire process. As you start to talk to investors, you want to build upon the momentum of talking to a bunch of investors, the momentum of follow-up, the momentum to pushing and driving that towards a close. So momentum is, I think, a very key word when you are fundraising. Another key component of fundraising are all the materials that are necessary. We'll be spending quite a bit of time on pitch decks today, and I know several of the companies from the GIA, I know you guys have spent times on pitch decks, so I'm going to try to make it a little interactive for you, and hopefully it won't be completely dry for those that already have a basis of their pitch deck. We're also going to be spending time on financial models. I've worked with clients where they're like, I don't need a financial model. I'm just going to go pitch and have conversations with investors. And I've kind of said, okay, if you think that that's going to work, good luck. But at some point in the process, they're going to ask you for a financial model. I've never seen a deal close without an investor wanting to see a financial model. So I'll just share that wisdom. Due diligence. Again, different types of investors go very deep in due diligence. Others are kind of a little more lax, but we're going to try to prepare you for if someone goes deep in diligence, what are the things that they're going to expect that you have ready. Some of the other materials that we're going to go into, term sheets, closing documents, negotiations. So those are kind of all the materials that you need to be prepared. There's other little things, but I think that pretty much covers it. Like if you have those things ready, I think you'll be in a good spot to fundraise. And then meetings. We're not going to be getting into a lot of the psychology and maybe the logistics of meetings, but meetings are a really important thing, and how you manage those meetings with investors and those follow-up meetings is an important part of the fundraising process. And this is often what the fundraising process looks like. As a very linear person, I would love if it was this. Just straight and narrow. You do this, and then you do this, and then you do this. My experience and the experience I've had from my clients is it often ends up like this. So you're going one path, sometimes you kind of come back here, you might get all the way to here, and all of a sudden things get messy up in here. And I just kind of like to give people that image of fundraising is a process, and I think you'll be more successful if you run it as a process, but be prepared for the twists and turns and the things you can't anticipate, and maybe just prepare your mindset of it's not going to probably be as linear as what we had all hoped. As you think about kind of the checklist, if you are kind of a linear person that wants to do kind of A and then B and then C, I tried to break it down into what would be some of the order in order to prepare for that fundraising. So really starting with momentum. I think it's virtually impossible to raise capital unless you have some sort of momentum. Again, thinking about the stage of your business, what does momentum mean for you? Jake, I'm going to call on you. What would momentum at this stage of the company mean for you?
It would mean securing supplier partnerships and also distribution deals.
So you have to have partnerships in order to really be in a good spot to raise. Todd, are you actively thinking about raising?
Yeah.
What would momentum look like for you?
Attention in social media.
Can you go a little bit further? Like brand awareness?
Yeah, so maybe Twitter followers, registrations within the platform, those sorts of things.
Okay. Trevor, what would momentum look like for you?
Supplier, like manufacturing contracts. So life insurers agreeing to write our product.
So you have to have some kind of basic product and relationships established in order for the product to get off the ground.
Yeah.
So depending, if you're a little bit later stage, momentum will be like a lot of investors will look at how many customers do you have and are those customers growing. Investor relationships. This is really key and really early on in the process. I've just seen this mistake over and over and over where people are like, okay, I'm now ready to raise. Who am I going to talk to? They haven't kind of done the work to start to build the relationships with investors. They haven't done the work to have any brand awareness. They haven't done the work to start making those contacts. Because it takes time. You know, you're ready to go. And someone might not respond to your email for 2 weeks. They might be on vacation. They might be closing another deal. All of it takes a lot of time. And so be thinking about who are the people that you would want to be fundraising from. How are you going to be making those connections, those relationships ahead of time before you're just like ready to go raise. I think it also plays into the next part of the process, which is starting to validate your strategy. There's a bunch of different ways for you to raise capital. You can raise capital from friends and family. You can raise capital from wealthy individuals. You can raise capital through angels. I have to say that true angel networks are kind of on the decline. We have some statistics on that there's not as many angel investments anymore. You're seeing those more either wealthy individuals or VC funds that have more of an early stage fund. There's early stage VCs to get in front of, and there's strategic investors. And it's helpful if you start to talk to individuals, see what their appetite is, what their interest is in companies like you. Do they make early stage investments? Starting to do that diligence sooner than later is helpful. The next part of the process is developing your pitch and starting to practice your pitch. I think practice is really important. Not practicing on an investor the first time you've given it is probably a really helpful idea. Building out your financial model, also something that's really important to do prior to starting to pitch, because if someone's really interested, they might want that financial model the next week. Organizing your due diligence is another part of the process. This is also something I always encourage people to do ahead of time. And don't wait for an investor to give you a due diligence list. Start to have a Dropbox of all your diligence pulled together ahead of time. We're going to be going into more detail on a lot of these areas. And then once you get to the investor meetings, there's introductory coffees, there's formal pitches, there's follow-up calls. Sometimes you have to come in and pitch the partner groups. This whole section could have like 7 or 8 additional bullet points under it once you get to that stage. Then there's the negotiation, managing the close, and ongoing communications. Does anyone have any questions so far around, kind of from my viewpoint, how I see the fundraising process?
So 2, and if these are more appropriate, if you want to defer them, that's fine. One is, actually they're both on the investor strategy. Have you found, is it necessary to raise friends and family before you can approach, other strangers basically? And I don't know if this is related or not, but you mentioned that angel groups are on the decline. I was wondering if you could provide a little more color on why that might be.
Yeah, I think that we might as well just hit those right now. So the investor strategy, I would say it's helpful, it's not mandatory. What it signals is that people that know you and trust you are willing to put money behind your idea. So I think it's validating, especially for investors that don't know you, right? They're like, okay, well this lady or woman, or this lady or male was able to get people that he knows or she knows to put money behind them. I think that that's what it serves, is kind of the validation of you as an entrepreneur. But I've never seen an investor say, oh, without an angel, friends and family, I won't do it. But it's helpful. Then when it comes to why angel funding is on decline, I believe in the appendix, I actually put an article in there that talks about it in depth. But kind of the general thesis is, as funds have gotten larger, they're just doing larger deals, and even the Series A or the seed round are becoming much larger than what you were seeing as angel funding. So it's somewhat of it just being swept upstream. What I find in the Midwest, and you could almost say non-coastal regions, I think angel funding is still pretty predominant. But as you look at statistically across the entire nation, because those large funds are doing larger seed round investments, it's not really falling in the angel category anymore. So you might also just think, what region would I be raising from and what's normal?
I also think, like, in terms of the friends and family round, would you also see it as the amount of money you need? So I'm thinking, if you're manufacturing something, it's hardware, and you need $4 billion, they might be like, okay, fair enough, you shouldn't have friends and family. But if you need 100K, it's like, why are you coming to us? Can you not find, 100K?
Yes, that will definitely fall into the strategy as well. And a lot of seed stage investors are just not interested in anything less than 500K to $1 million.
Right.
And if you only need 100K to get to the next milestone without a lot of dilution and to prove things out, it's like, why would you over raise if you kind of had a very specific set of milestones in front of you that required less capital?
Right.
Okay, this is kind of beating the point on over the head. This is just a zoom in once you pitch to get to a term sheet, what you can expect. There's many pages within just pitching to term sheet to close. I'm not going to go into all the nuances here, but I tried to just overlay it. Again, these are from client experiences where they're like, pitching is going really great. And then 2 months later, they still haven't closed because the negotiations took a lot of time. The diligence took much more time. The partners required them to come back in, and their partner meeting wasn't for 2.5 weeks later. So, it just creates these gaps in the timeline of you think you're almost there, and all of it just continues to take more time. So be prepared for that. And I think that why Mike and I like to really hone in on this is most of your businesses are very capital sensitive. So if you think you're going to close and you're almost out of cash and it takes another 3 months, what's going to happen to your business? Just be thinking about anticipating that it might take more time and what you're going to do from a cash standpoint during that very critical point of your business. All right. There is a separate handout called the slide deck workbook that we're going to be actively working through. But before we get into the pitch deck, I think it's just really important. If your idea and execution are lacking, it doesn't really matter how good your pitch is. You can be a great storyteller, but if the underlying business, if the underlying idea, and if you don't have execution isn't there, you're going to have a really hard time raising capital. Some of the typical pitch deck slides that we have seen in early stage companies are these like 15 plus slides here. And I just pulled them out. I'm like, there's no magic way to pitch, but these are the typical slides that you would see in a compelling pitch deck. I'm not going to go through all of them here. I would say if you try to do every single one, your deck is going to be too long. So find what makes sense for the way your business is structured, the way that you are a storyteller. Ultimately, as an entrepreneur, you're telling the story of your business. So the slides should be in kind of a natural way that you would tell the story. But these are several of the different themes and topics that you should pick from in order to put together a compelling pitch deck. And again, limit your slides at around 11 or 12. That's where the challenge comes in. I've seen people that want 10 slides just on their product or 4 slides on what their problem is. You're going to lose the intention of an investor, so you really have to think about how to make that short and sweet.
So how about, and maybe as part of the pitch, 11 or 12, but a larger deck with some backup slides in case they want to get that done?
Right. So I think that is very appropriate, is to have a whole bunch of appendix slides ready to go. So if someone asks you a question, you could flip to it. What I also encourage people, though, is if you have a really condensed storyline, to stay on track and say, if we have time at the end of that, I'd be happy to go in further detail. Because what can happen is you can go so far in detail that you kind of lose the momentum around what's the whole picture that you're trying to paint. And that's why it's also helpful to kind of boil it up and keep it high level. Because oftentimes you really have 5 minutes of the investor's intention to hook them before who knows what they're thinking about, right? But if they're excited, they're going to stay with you and go deeper. So this next thing is just kind of talking about, what are investors looking for? Obviously, they're looking for a really big market opportunity. Often your strategic investors or VCs are looking for something that has over $1 billion market potential. I've had some people just look at me like, what do you mean? My little idea is not going to get funded. It's like a $100 million opportunity. That's a great opportunity. And I would say $100 million is a wonderful opportunity if that's the entire market size, but you're probably not going to get the big VC funding. So just kind of know who your audience is and what they're looking for. If they can get $1 billion market opportunity, they're going to go for those companies all day long. More local strategic investors might go for smaller opportunities. So that just kind of narrows, there's different forks in the road as far as who you talk to throughout the fundraising journey. A great team. You don't necessarily have to all have 50 years or 20 years of experience in the area, but who have you put together to convince an investor that you're the team to pull this off? Sometimes it's just ambition and hustle that will show an investor that you, along with some investor board members and advisors, you know what it takes to get it done. A strong business model is always really important. How do you plan to charge? Do the fundamentals make sense? Do you have a big enough vision? Do they believe in your vision? You have a strong enough vision. Sometimes people start businesses because they see an opportunity and they think they can do it, but they're not very passionate about it. That starts to come through when you're pitching and meeting with investors. So, do you have the passion? Do you have the vision to pull off the business that you're working on? And then, is there any competitive moat or secret sauce? Is there anything preventing someone else from going and raising $10 million and doing exactly what you've done? So those are some of the key things that, as investors are meeting with you, that they're looking for. I would say use Google when you're trying to put together your pitch deck. I'm sometimes a very visual learner, and I feel like I'm the artist who likes to take stuff and recraft it. Google has a lot of amazing pitch decks out there. So if you need some ideas of, hey, I don't know the best way to structure my pitch deck, I don't know the best way to tell my story, go look on Google. There's a plethora of pitch decks that you might pull some ideas from. Some other things that I think are helpful in structuring your pitch deck. When you start building your pitch deck, I think it's perfectly okay to say problem, solution, team, like very generic headings. But as you iterate on it, if you're able to take problem and all of a sudden do a headline rather than your slide saying problem, I think it becomes a much more compelling story. That if an investor was only to read your headlines, what could they learn? That's a kind of a trick that I've learned over the years of if you just read each single headline, you should be able to kind of walk away knowing what this company does, what they're solving, and why you should be excited. I think that this is a great example. Instead of saying team, you could say the right mix of passion and experience. That's much more compelling than saying team. Language. Avoid phrases that everyone uses. Like, I'm so sick of seeing disruptive, innovative, world-class. What does that mean? And use your voice. Ultimately, you're the one going to be giving this pitch, and if it feels like textbook, wonderful pitch deck, but it's not your language, you're going to stumble. It's not going to come across authentically. So think through how you talk, how you tell a story.
Should we? Just out of curiosity, because 2 slides back you talked about the $1 billion market segment, or capacity, I think you call it, but does the pitch deck change much whether you're going for that scale or whether, let's say, you're in a local level and you're trying to raise capital for a much smaller business, but you still have the same process to go through? Does the deck change much?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say the structure can stay the same. Just the way that you talk about the opportunity and who you would be raising from would change.
So it goes back to strategy, it seems,
Goes back to
and
strategy.
who you're approaching.
And then it might change the way that you actually pitch. So if you're not going kind of after professional VCs or professional angels, you're going more after kind of the friends and family or local investors. They don't always necessarily need a pitch deck. It might be a coffee where you say, hey, I want to go through this idea with you. It might be more conversational, but I think doing the work to put the pitch deck together is very beneficial because it really makes you can kind of condense your talking points, and it also gives you some material to leave with them after you meet with them. I love this little graph. Most people's attention, I don't even think makes it to 5 minutes. I think there's a new study out that was like 37 seconds and you can lose someone's attention. So you're really excited about your business, you're really engaged, but it doesn't mean necessarily an investor is going to follow with you. And that also means that you might have to be making the same point several times throughout the investor pitch. Because even though you made it once, that might have been when he was looking at his phone, he or she was making her phone, right? I had to learn this the hard way of over and over we were pitching investors and they would come back with these questions where like, I can't believe they missed that. Like that was so obvious to me pitching them. And then I learned, well, I only said it once here and maybe I didn't say it as clearly as what I thought. And it was about 5 minutes into the pitch, so maybe they weren't paying attention. I think we all want to believe that everyone's going to just be kind of at the edge of the seat listening to us, but the reality is these investors and just as human beings, we're so wired to multitask that the attention isn't always there. So think about that when you're structuring your pitch deck. If they were only to walk away with 1 or 2 things, that should be at the beginning of your deck versus you spending the first 5 minutes talking about you and what your experience is and where you grew up and you know what, that's probably not going to be the thing that sells the investor on investing in you. So save that for maybe later in the pitch. So the first 5 minutes are really the most important to hooking the interest of the investor. And you can always spend the rest of the meeting deep diving, but this is also where you kind of, what I mentioned, Bernie, is really keeping on point of trying to tell your entire story in its totality. in the first 5 minutes. All right, now we are going to kind of start a working session. For any of you that have already done pitch decks, I would normally say like don't have your computer out the entire time, but if you want to pull out your computer, pull up your pitch deck, it's totally appropriate to do that because we're going to be working each slide in depth. So starting with the cover slide, this is, I always like that you put your positioning statement on your cover slide. This is kind of your tagline, you know, the who, what, how, why. Why do you exist? What is your company there for? And this sets the stage for them. They can just, you know, look at the first slide and already start to get a feel for what you're about. So, pulling out the workbook, let's start to work on what would be your positioning statement. Can I have a few people willing to share their statement? Bernie.
Sure. Strategic Holdings helps entrepreneurs to achieve their dreams by providing guidance, connections, and funding in a word partnership.
Thank you. How does that resonate with everyone else? Thoughts, feedback?
I like that it's simple and short. I don't have to like roll this little what is it, what? Yeah. I like that.
Other thoughts, feedback?
Can you hear it again?
Can you hear it? Can you say it one more time?
Sure. Sorry. Strategic Holdings helps entrepreneurs to achieve their dreams by providing guidance, connections, and funding in a word partnership.
So it's like a one-stop shop for an entrepreneur to, you know, take their idea and turn it into an actual business. Yeah. So yeah, it's good.
You tell me, I mean.
That's what it sounds like to me.
Perfect.
Yeah.
That's what I'm going for.
Yeah. Then yeah, that's good.
Can I have another person share? Sorry, your name?
Oh, Bob,
Bob.
3DP, the future look at military communications.
Short, sweet. How do you do it?
KK.
Can't tell me. Still trying to figure it out. Okay, so that's a great point.
It's close.
Yeah, there's times that you don't exactly know the details, right? And so that might be an area of like, it is short and sweet, but as you figure out more, I would encourage you to be more specific. You want to share yours?
Sure. Prosper, we measure and monitor your body's internal biological clock to help people live stronger, longer lives.
Any questions, feedback for Richard?
It's a little long.
What would you cut?
I'd probably just get stronger, longer, and make it one word.
Okay.
Prosper has a lot of financial connotations. I mean, it doesn't need to, but that made me, as soon as you said prosper, I went to financial in my brain.
Jake, you want to share yours?
Sure. Everyday life helps middle-income people feel confident they can provide for their families no matter what by providing an online insurance concierge service.
My initial reaction, it's a little wordy.
Yeah.
It's hard to slice and dice as we're like standing here, but I would encourage you to think about, can you cut some words out?
Sure, yeah.
And there's also times where you have kind of multiple forms, an expanded form and a much shorter form. If you think about your deck, your logo, a date, and this line, like I really feel like it should be not multiple lines, but visually, it should be like the line that gets people interested.
This positioning statement.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, we're going to keep moving. We have a lot of ground to cover. The first slide, the problem. So this is the slide that gets into what are you solving? What customer pain point are you alleviating? Why does your company exist? And just kind of a word of caution, avoid looking like a solution looking for a problem. And this sometimes happens, as entrepreneurs, you just get stuck on this great idea, and the idea and the excitement around it was what, as an entrepreneur, drew you to it. Sometimes you do have to go back and say, why was I excited about that? What is the problem? And that's the challenge. Not all companies are started out of a problem, but if you're going to convince an investor, they want to know why should you exist? What's the problem? And it's more than just your excitement, or just more than your idea. So I'm going to give you around, we're going to just kind of try to speed this up. I'm going to give you about 3 minutes to work on your problem. Move on from the problems slide and now get to, here's an example. In your book, there was a problem slide. Price hotels, no easy way to this. Just an example of being very succinct in the way that you talk about your problem. I don't think there's any magic rule of 3, but I've seen this successfully pulled off. If you kind of find 3 different areas to hone in on why there's a problem, it makes it succinct and an easy way to communicate your problem statement. Here's one other example. The reason I like this problem statement is they were already able to kind of pull in the size of the opportunity when they're talking about the problem. And when you think back to that, you only have a minute to 5 minutes to 30 seconds to get an investor's attention. If you can paint the picture in numbers early on, I think it can be a very compelling way to start off your pitch. Now let's move into the solution. So the solution slide explains how you alleviate the pain in the problem. And you might get as specific to say, I'm a web platform, I'm a SaaS software, I'm hardware. Let them know, more specifically how you're doing it, and then just demonstrate how you make your customer's life better. This is an example from Airbnb's very early pitch deck. They save money, they make money, and they create a sharing culture. So that's how they were able to very succinctly say, these are the things we solve for. One of the ways that you can also think about it is if you're breaking your problems statement into kind of 3 themes, essentially the solution can mirror, if these 3 problems exist, this is, the solution side of it. They should, go hand in hand.
I have a question. Maybe, I have a lot of solutions, so I'm trying to think of how to hone it. So which is why I could share a bunch of them, but what I'm intrigued with is how do you convey a solution that's very esoteric? That's what I'm wrestling with. I can talk about things as broad as long-term value or the house gives you joy. But when you're talking about energy, when you're talking about a house's ability to provide well-being, a lot of what I hear in this is it's a solution that's very tactile. I save money, but a lot of times in people's homes there's an expression of emotion or even something that's even more abstract as well-being.
Okay.
And I've been trying to figure out how to translate that in a business context. You see where I'm going?
Yeah, so I think this is where, I sometimes spend hours with clients on 2 slides, problem and solution, right? And we talk through it and we look at it from different angles. So just off the top of my head, it's hard to say, here you go.
Sure.
But I would encourage you to think about, 1, what resonates with you. So if it is joy, you're creating joy, that's a big statement. But if you can be visionary behind that and get behind, my solution creates joy, I think it's interesting. And as an investor, I'd want to know more, right? I'm like, well, how do you do that? So if you want to make those statements, I don't think that they don't have to be as linear as maybe a software solution. I don't know what kind of product you have. That could be somewhat compelling for me to want to learn more.
So a good example might be that there's a company called Calm, C-A-L-M, and they sell basically calmness. They just raised another $150 million on a $1 billion valuation, and they're one of the most recent unicorns. So don't sell it short, but you might go out and look at what Calm is doing, and how they're saying it. Because they actually produce a ton of revenue too. Besides the fact they got a crazy valuation, they raise a lot of money, they make a lot of money. They're selling an app on the store that's like $100 a year, $80 a year, $70 a year, and they're selling a lot of it. So on the base point, there is a market. You just got to find the language, and they might be a good example.
They are saying selling to employers, right? So they have a very good business model.
They sell to individuals too.
Yeah.
But the revenue,
And it works.
right now, comes from large employers. So it's not like, I don't know, I've never seen a company that would sell something abstract to an individual and make lots of money. They're very straightforward about how they make money and what they sell and all their plans for employers.
Well,
So
I
it's
hope they
like a
did
help.
still give some context though.
Right.
on
Yeah.
The language.
What was the company called?
Calm, C-A-L-M.
That's a great example. Thanks, Mike. Moving on to product. So when you think about product slides, there's a lot of different ways you can talk about your product. It might be screenshots, it might be actual photos. There's some investors that love demos, and I would say try not to do a live demo. I've just seen it go wrong so many times. So if you want to do video capturing of you doing a demo, that's probably a more effective way than, also it's hard to stay on point. You're like, oh, I'm just gonna log in and do this and do this and do this, and 3, 4, 5 minutes later, you've kind of killed your pitch doing your demo. So screenshots, photos are just really helpful of kind of giving a flavor for what is it that you've created. Some investors are, I call it like product junkies. They just, if they love the product, they'll invest in you, and likely that's the investor you would do a deep dive after this kind of initial pitch on your product, rather than spending the first 5 minutes going really deep in your product. But think about, how do you best represent your product? We're not going to actually workshop this one. You guys can workshop this one on your own. Does anyone have any questions, or do they have a product they're like, I don't know how I would demonstrate it?
Well, one, for many of us, probably our products are, or at least are still in development. So, what are good ways for early stage companies where you might not have the prettiest screenshots to show?
There's a couple ways to go about it. There's, I think, danger in putting something that's not actually in existence on your product page, right? Because then an investor thinks it exists. There's a danger of not having anything. So I would say kind of meet you kind of in the middle where, if you don't have anything, then you should probably put together some mock-ups and say, this is a mock-up of how our products, how we think it's going to function. We might be getting user feedback and it's subject to change, but there's something there.
Can you
Don't make
show
it.
the beta version?
Yeah, I think you can show beta and just be clear where it's
Yeah.
at. Be careful not to be so apologetic though, like,
Okay.
oh, this isn't good enough, da 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 da, because it takes like the momentum out of that slide when you're like, oh, it's only beta, it's only this, only that.
Yeah.
Don't be so apologetic with where you're at. Just say, this is where we're at. These are the initial beta screens. We're doing testing. It's likely gonna, continue to evolve.
Yeah.
Jen.
So I have one and I have renderings already done by my architect.
Uh-huh.
What if for fear of something they take, is that something where just non-disclosure right out the gates?
Uh,
So they don't replicate the model that I have already put time and money to build?
So there's a lot of debate around NDAs and putting yourself out there. My general attitude and a lot of investors' attitude is they won't sign an NDA. Just most strategic investors are just like, I see too many deals, I'm not going to sign an NDA. And I think this is where trust in yourself and belief that you're the one that's meant to create this comes into play. They might get a rendering, but it's going to take a whole much more than a rendering to pull off what you have, right? So you kind of have to believe that you have what it's going to take to be successful. And if you have the idea, you're probably not the only one that has the idea. I mean, that's just reality, right? And investors aren't really in the business of ripping off people's ideas. If they are, they're not the investors you want to be talking to. So I would just use your own discretion on that going into it. Bernie?
Due diligence goes both ways.
Right. That's a good way to state it.
What did he say?
Due diligence goes both ways. I mean, you have to kind of have trust in who you're sitting in front of. and integrity in them as well, and both sides. Trevor?
Are you sugarcoating the language when you say that, your general thought is that VCs don't sign NDAs? Or like, have you ever seen a VC sign an NDA?
I've had strategic investors sign NDAs.
Yeah.
I've never had a VC sign an NDA, never. And I mean, that was like one of the things I learned early on, like, hey, will you sign this NDA? And they're like, have you ever raised capital? I mean, that was essentially the response I got, was like, we do not sign NDAs. But if it's strategic, they often will.
Oh.
And that, I find that sometimes the strategics will actually lead the way of saying, here's our NDA, because they want to share their problems with you as well, so that there's more collaboration. Any other questions on product, like how you should develop a site? David?
So you've got this model set up for the product, it's more of this kind of software thing, Airbnb. If you're doing more of a service-oriented or consulting service, what do you put on the side?
It's probably, you might have to use icons or photos. I mean, if, like you helping someone, right? If you're a service-based industry. But that's where you make it very clear of like, you're providing a service and there may or may not be actual, like tangible things around it. Any other questions when it comes to product? Okay. Next one, market size. So breaking the market down by total available, serviceable, and share. This example, again, is from one of Airbnb's early pitch deck. I really kind of like the way they did it. So 2 billion trips are booked worldwide. That's their total available market. And then 560 million are budget and online. So that's where they said, of all this travel that can occur in the world, we're focused on budget and online. So they slice their market, budget, online. That's their serviceable available market. And then they think if they got 15% of the market, that would be 84 million trips with Airbnb. And what I'll show in the next slide, I think that these go hand in hand. They take their market size, they get to this 84 million, and then they show, okay, so what's our revenue opportunity? So when you're thinking about breaking down the market, one of my big pet peeves is like someone who just says, it's $1 billion market, there's all this money spent in an area. And my question is, but how are you going to make money in that market? Your slice of it might be super, super small, and it's just a big number. You need to figure out like how it applies to your business. So back to Airbnb, they take those 84 million trips and they say an average of $25 fee. That's how they would get to 200 million of revenue on 15% of that market share. I know that's a lot to cover super, super fast. What kind of questions exist, or Trevor?
Do you like when it's presented total market and segmented market and then the amount of market you can get, kind of like a top-down chart? Or do you prefer, you think it should be broken out kind of like this, a little bit more?
I think however it's logical for you to walk through it. Like, what's the most logical way for you to say, there's this big opportunity, I'm focused on this, this is how, and if I take a percentage of that, this is how I can make money. That's the way I like it done. I think it makes the market more palatable than just saying, here's everything. And I'm not, without getting deep into your business, the question is like, what's unique about that segment? And do you think, are there any, why'd you pick that segment? So when you make that break, saying why are you focused on that segment? It's like there's two sides to that. Sometimes that segment can be too small. So you might end up with a number that's only like 50 million if you capture the entire thing. Right? So then it's like you've almost undersold yourself if you think you're going to go after more markets in the future. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So think about the best way. It's kind of like massaging what's the best way to show the data, to show the opportunity, but then also show your focus. And there's kind of multiple ways to do that. Any other questions about market size? Jen?
Maybe about market size specifically, but like market feasibility studies, like how how long before they're considered out of date? Is it 1, 2, 3 years? Because it does provide one for 2017, so if I don't have to go pay for another one supported what I'm doing.
So market feasibility, I have some thoughts. Mike, do you have any initial thoughts?
Well, feasibility, the market feasibility is going to be relative to how quick the market changes. So every market changes at a different rate. You know, like the auto industry, it takes 4 or 5 years to create a car, so you can't just flip the model out there and react and go a year. So a couple of years feasibility age is not going to kill it. You get into consumer habits in music. Online downloadable music, it changes every day, so you almost can't do it feasible. So I think you have to understand what's the life cycle or the sell cycle in the marketplace. How often do people buy and acquire?
Yeah, from my experience, like super early on when you're raising capital in a, again, a technology software-based business, I've never had an investor ask me for market feasibility study. It's more, what's my traction? I mean, that's more what's showing feasibility, especially when you're creating a new product in like technology and software. I think what you're building is different, so the way you think about market feasibility might be different than my experience in software.
Sorry, on market size, just one thing, I hear people say, like in your pitch, don't say, if we could only get 1% of this market or whatever, we'd all be billionaires. Like, so, but it's okay to say here, look, we think it's reasonable that we're gonna capture 10% of this market or whatever.
Yeah, Trevor and I were just talking about this. I think it's like, you want to show the opportunity size, but then you have to be able to back it up. I was actually talking to Tobin in the back, and he said, well, I think my number is I mean, you had like 80-some million. I was like, really? Are you going to raise $500 million to go acquire those customers? Like, it's okay if you put a big number there, but you better think about truly what do you think about capturing. And you know, like we know Airbnb has far surpassed that in revenue, right? And I think they had projected that by 2011, and this was like a deck put out in like 07 or 08 for them. So, you know, over a 4 or 5 year period, they thought that that was a reasonable way to demonstrate it. I think as you demonstrate it, be able to back up why you think that's the case. Or say, you know, Trevor and I were talking about, we're so early on, we think it's reasonable to capture, you know, 5 or 10% of the market. I'm not sure how long it's going to take me to get there. Natasha.
So when Airbnb put this number, 200 million, did they have revenue? Did they show a projection? We are making whatever, 5 million, and we are growing year to year.
Yeah, they were very early on, but they had initial traction and were able to show financials that say, this is how we think we can get there.
So I mean, are people looking for traction and growth trajectory that you can, then you say this is how it's going to go because this is how I'm doing today?
Yeah, so I'm going to qualify that based on what stage you're in. You know, sometimes you're so early on to put out those projections. You need to put together projections that show if I put this money into my business, I think I can get here. But know that they're projections, right? As you become a little bit further along, they're going to be narrowing in on your projections even more. Okay, if you're $3 million this year, is it reasonable to say you would double or triple that growth? And then is it reasonable to say the following year you would double or triple that growth? I mean, it's kind of a reasonability, and how do you plan to operate your business to get there? So you have to show some logic, but you have to also realize that some of it you don't know. I mean, this was some of my frustration in raising money, is like, if I could predict the future, I'd be a billionaire, right? But then I realized that they're not always looking at what you can predict, but they're looking at your methodology. Like they're thinking that they want to really talk to you as an entrepreneur of, if you raise X capital, what do you think is reasonable to achieve? And do those make sense? I've seen this in the financial model where someone shows they're going to grow to $20 million in revenue, and they're going to have a 5-person team. Like, we just know that's not reasonable. You know, your expenses are likely going to be maybe 15, 20 million when you're making 20 million. I mean, there's this like whole part of growing and scaling a company where you're spending just about as much as you are making before you kind of hit this tipping point and are capturing the market. That's a lot of information. I feel like we have to kind of go deeper one-on-one. It's a very complicated subject to kind of give a broad overview on. Trevor?
We had meetings, like early meetings with the VC with just their associates, and they actually said when we move you the formal process, we prefer if you just strip out all your numbers, projected market, because they're just like, you guys are way too early and there's nobody to benchmark you against. So.
That's interesting.
That's interesting, yeah.
Yeah, and you might talk to another investor and they said, well, where's your analysis of this,
Oh, yeah.
right? And that's what you'll get to when you're raising money. Someone over here will say one thing, another investor will say another investor will say another. And as an entrepreneur, you just have to be able to defend your methodology.
On the tipping point, is there like, I know obviously every business is different, but is there like year 3, year 5 is where you can expect to see that tip to happen? Or, I mean, obviously it's very dynamic based on what you're doing, but is there a kind of general rule of thumb there? Just kind of benchmark yourself?
So I would say one is very dynamic, depends on what business you're in, depends on what your vision for the business is, depends on what kind of investors you have. I mean, more conservative investors are going to want to show profitability and break in even sooner. Coastal investors, they could care less about profitability. They want you to just build as massive amount of business as possible. I mean, you think about some of the billion-dollar companies out on the coast. They're losing money. They're losing hundreds of millions of dollars in money because they're so focused on growth. Like in a more conservative region, taking that approach for your business plan would not fly. You probably wouldn't be able to raise capital. Here's my opinion.
Therese, I actually had Microsoft get back with me, and they jumped from my idea and said as soon as I get a prototype to call it. I mean, they jumped over all these different steps. Have you come across anything like that before?
Well, they'll say get back to me, but they'll then expect a lot of work and detail behind it.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It's probably their way of saying you're too early on, but when you hit another milestone, give us a call.
Okay.
But they're likely going to go deep at that point if they're truly interested.
Yeah.
And I think it's the point. Some entrepreneurs are really successful in raising money on just an idea. I would say that's very, 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 very hard to do, but it does happen. All right, so we've talked about business model, now going into competition. Who are you competing against? What makes you better and different? I would say really do your diligence on who your competitors are. It's better for you to know everyone who could be a potential competitor than an investor asking you questions about a handful of companies you haven't heard. You can go online, there's a bunch of different tools to find competition. I have to say you're probably not the only one with an idea. And so even if your idea is different, it's better to say, these are all the people that could be taking some of our market share, and this is why we're different. Crunchbase, AngelList, those are good sources to find competitors. Mike, do you mind telling a story early on of someone once told you, like, I have no competitors, you entered in kind of their company segment into AngelList or Crunchbase?
Yeah, it's really common for an angel investor. I do some angel investing, I run an angel group, and it's really common to hear there are no competitors. And so first of all, there's a couple kinds of competition. There's direct competition. I make trucks, you make trucks. There's also, the substitute. It's you're buying A, B doesn't exist, whatever your cool idea is, but you're buying something else to do the same thing. So the problem I run into is many times someone will say, well, there's nobody doing this, and I'll go on and search Crunchbase, Pitch Deck, AngelList, and I'll find lists and lists of people who are doing it. So it's be really careful when you do your competition slide, because especially the more experienced investors, they have tools, very expensive tools in some cases. The paid version of Crunchbase is not the same as free, but they're going to do that research. So you've got to make sure you know what's out there. And again, don't look for companies that are already launched. You've got to go into AngelList and look for the teams that are saying, I'm looking for somebody that can build this product. Because there are a lot of people just like you out there in the build process. It's very unlikely you're standing on your own with an idea.
Just a personal story too. Sometimes you get so deep in your business and operating it and building it that you don't always take the time to like look up and see what others are doing. Because I used to have some of the opinion of it doesn't really matter what they're doing. I have to execute well on what I'm doing. And I have so much in front of me. If I would just execute, we'd be successful. But I learned the hard way of not taking the time prior to like kind of going into investor meetings where they were saying names of companies, and I probably looked like a deer in a headlight. I hadn't heard of these companies. In a simple search, you can go online and they just raised $5 million. They just raised $2 million. I should have been doing my research. I should have been kind of staying up on the competition. Again, but that's hard when you're so into your own business. But I would say, kind of from my own lessons learned, take the time to be following what's happening in your industry, taking time before you go out and raise money to see what's going on. Hop your head up, out of the sand and see what's all going on.
Do you have a widget or something technical? Have you used anybody else's code? Have you done a patent check? What's your legal risk? That's the question I'm going to want to know.
From an investor standpoint, yep. Here's an example of how to build a competition site. Again, this was an example based on Bed and Breakfast, Airbnb. And this is kind of the magic quadrant where you want to be in the upper right-hand side. So they are affordable and they offer online transactions. And kind of historically remembering back at the time, there weren't a lot of online marketplaces that you could book something online. So that's really where they were different than the competition. And Airbnb, they were, hostels.com was another option, but they were saying, they offer online, but they're not affordable. Craigslist was affordable, but an offline booking transaction. Then they were comparing themselves to VRBO, which at the time didn't offer online booking capability. And they were also saying, VRBO is way more expensive than what we are, Airbnb. Hotels.com, so they're saying, this is kind of an existing player in their marketplace. And Airbnb were cheaper than hotels, but hotels are also booking online. So that just kind of gives you an idea of a matrix. I also want to use this as an example. I don't always like this affordable, expensive comparison. I think it's kind of dangerous to compete on price. What else are you going to be good at besides price? And it's not always the best being the cheapest. In this case, Airbnb said, you know what, affordability is something that we're going to really kind of put our foot down and make a strategic, we're going to be strategically different in that way. But again, don't just kind of say, we're cheaper. That's like our other majors. I'm going to give you a little bit of time to work on competition. Are there questions around competition sites?
When you're presenting this slide, you talked about maybe doing like AngelList searches and those sorts of things, maybe some of the smaller competitors in that space. When you're presenting this, how important or strategically, when you're having that conversation about like...
Hey, sorry, it's just a little hard to hear.
This is how my business compares to things that are familiar, perhaps, to the investor that you're talking to versus here's this sort of abstract company that also is doing this very same thing. How do you have that conversation?
So if someone's doing the very same thing, how are you going to win? Those are the things you have to think about. So you do really have to say, like, if I was sitting pitching against this other company, this is why I think I'm better. And this is hard to do, It really is forcing you to think, why is someone going to choose me versus my competitor?
Is it good to bring those on? Sorry to interrupt. Is it good to bring those on the competition slide, those competitors?
I think as you talk about them, yes. They should fit somewhere. And it might be that they're close to you. You might be, you're up here, and they might be close, but you might be nuanced and better. Sometimes it's platform offering. It's a lot of my clients want to go into the features. And I said, yeah, that's great, but what if someone just goes into the money? That other competitor can have just as many features as you. So when you think about even feature-based, why is your product better? Is it that you offer a full platform and someone else offers a limited platform? Without knowing your business, it's kind of hard to talk about generically. Another thing to think about is sometimes you're competing against like established old ways. So Excel, Microsoft Word, email, Facebook. I mean, those might be your competitors that you're completely coming up with a new way to do something better than Excel. But Excel should probably be on your sheet of like a static-based solution versus a dynamic-based solution. Does that make sense? How to think about the landscape?
I kind of a two-part question.
Mm-hmm.
One is, I just want to confirm, it's probably powerful if your axes here relate to the key elements of your solution that you're, so Airbnb probably they were talking about being online and being affordable, so that's what shows up here. You don't want to be presenting new concepts here, as far as your basis of your competition should align with the key elements of your solution more or less.
When you think about even your problem and solution slides, oftentimes they start to frame up how you think of competing.
Right. Okay. And then has the 2x2 jumped the shark, or is it still the preferred way to present it?
There's multiple ways to do the competition slide. From a storytelling standpoint, I found this very effective because you don't get in the weeds on, you've probably seen the feature slide, which is me and everyone else, and here how my features are different.
Yeah.
I think that's more feature and functionality versus this is the landscape of anyone who could use my tool. These are the things that they could be using. And it's a little hard, for example, if you were competing against Excel for usage, like how do you put that on a feature and functionality? It's more challenging.
Yeah.
And you can go deeper into, my features, like how my features are better, but I don't think that really shows competition.
Okay.
Trevor.
What about talking about competitors that fail?
What point would you be trying to make?
They came into the space, they tried to do it. The reason they failed is because we're, things that we've said that we're going to do well.
It might work. I just be careful not to get into a rabbit hole.
Okay.
And also then you bring into a doubt for an investor of like, well, if they fail, and if they were a big company, if they were well funded and they couldn't figure it out, that's kind of naive, Trevor, to think you just got it all figured out. Like, there's probably more nuances in it that might raise more doubt than like confidence. You might be able to pull it off. I'm not saying you can't, but.
No. The points you made, I'm probably saying.
On the flip side of that, like, it wouldn't be direct competition because it's not in the same market. But if there's someone doing something similar, but in, let's say on the coast, is it a good idea to try and benchmark if they're super successful at that point? So here's a competitor, but it's not within this market, and this is what they're doing. Here are the numbers that support or corroborate what I'm trying to do in this market.
That could be compelling. Again, it's a little abstract for me to give you like exact feedback on. It kind of goes twofold, right? What my initial thoughts are is if that venue, are they singularly focused, or would they sometimes come into this market? So in some sense, it again might bring in that doubt of like, okay, if they're that great, they might expand nationally, and in 5 years you're not going to have a business because you're not national. I've seen that with some of like the hyper-local competitors to delivery services of, oh, that's great that you've created a local delivery service, but catch up 5 years when all those, big city companies come here, are you going to still have a business? So it's not always a point you want to make, or you should be able to like address it at that point of how would you compete if the companies that you're using an example of success were to come compete with you. Trevor.
Going back to like Crunchbase, you can see some of your competitors and the VCs that invested in them. Is going after those VCs typically a good idea?
If they're direct competitors, likely not. There's no magic rule, but what I often find is most VCs are investing in a lot of direct competitors to their portfolio companies. That's not always the case, but usually the case. They have to see that you're enough different and going after enough like different market share for them to say, I'm going to put chips into both of these companies. And then from an entrepreneur standpoint, I would have to be a little leery too of how close you are and who's serving on which boards, because what information sharing is happening within that firm. And do you want them knowing kind of your next strategic move if they're invested in a somewhat competitive company? So as an entrepreneur, I think you also have to make that decision.